Thank you, Miriam. Good afternoon, everybody. Here from Gainesville. We had a lovely lunch thanks to Elise, so that was nice. I'm going to talk here for, I guess, about 20 minutes on emergency plans as living/dynamic documents. And I don't have all those wonderfully jazzy slides about, you know, the destruction and things that happens during the emergencies, but instead I'm going to talk about more of the administrative side of these documents and how we handle it on a daily basis and how you integrate it into, you know, not everything you do in the museum, but and I say daily, it's probably a little less than that, but how you incorporate it into administratively what goes on in the museum. So let me advance my, sorry, I'm trying to see from a distance here, slides. When we talk about a living document, I mean, you can go on the internet and get definitions of all kinds, but essentially we're talking about a dynamic document, a document that is continuously updated. And that, of course, is, I think, one of the biggest stumbling blocks for people, is that they hear those words about it always being continuously updated, and they get worried about these monikers, and it stops people from implementation. So there's going to be a number of points where I discuss the fact that, you know, yes, it changes, yes, you update it, yes, it's living, but certainly don't let those things impede you from pressing the button or launching the plan for the first time or things like that. I do think it is very important that you assign, let me just also say, I'm basing this on the assumption that we all have a plan in place, we've all initiated it, so this is not so much for the people who haven't started a plan, but this is after we all write our plans and have them in place. I think it's important that you assign, and I say at least, an annual review date, and stick to that. And I'm going to talk about dates a little bit later, but you do have to pick that time frame and be pretty religious about it. I think the looser you are about it, if you were to, let's say I instituted a plan today, if I said, well, you know, I'll look at it again in 2014, well, you know, there's 12 months in 2014 or 2013, and you could really fall into the trap of not looking at it in that entire time frame. And let me also stress that all of these things that we do administratively, we shouldn't assume that it will be us doing these things. I mean, God forbid, people move on, things happen, certain people aren't in the same positions, etc. So we should be instituting these things and assigning these dates and administratively handling these documents on the thought that somebody else, perhaps, or some other group of people might be taking care of these documents. So with a living document, you want to sort of literally, if you will, feed this type of document. You don't feed it with, you know, actual food and water, but you do feed it with time and attention. And that, of course, is something that will depend on who gives what time and attention to it. Depends on which staff are dealing with it. I think most of the time and attention to this sort of thing comes from the essential staff that are outlined in the document. And the essential staff, of course, vary from place to place. But these are the staff that are really going to feed the document. They're going to critique it. They're going to edit it. They're going to update it. And they're going to get into a lot of the details. But when we talk about a living document, we just really want to make sure that we understand that it changes, but that we do not get hung up on, you know, even the title. Something as silly as, not silly as that. In the course of these 6 months, I think we've all thrown around a variety of titles for what these emergency plan, disaster plan, emergency preparedness plan, ER plan, etc. I mean, it is important, but it is not something that should ever hold you up. So that may change as part of a living document, but you have to sort of force yourself to move ahead with it at some point and continue to feed it. So just as an example, here are some documents that would technically be considered not to be living documents. Of course, it doesn't mean that they're dead documents, but it sort of means that they have a bit of a start and an end point more than the emergency plan does. So, for example, correspondence, you know, a letter, a memo, a directive, or something like that. MOUs, MOAs, contracts, scholarly works, etc. Yes, all of these things could change in time. I could write you a letter, realize I wrote it poorly or something, and rewrite you another letter, but that's not really the same thing as updating a document in terms of the plans. And if you were to update a contract or an memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement, etc., you wouldn't really be updating it in the same sense you would this plan. You'd essentially have a new contract. So that's kind of the difference. And these things that I point out have also pre-assigned dates and things that probably come from an external source. So if you're working on an MOA or a contract with a vendor or a lawyer or something like that, there's going to be dates set in there that you're going to have to follow. Or if you're publishing a scholarly article, a journal or a publication is going to tell you your article has to be done at this point. So there are some finite things in there that are out of your control, as opposed to our living document where we're controlling the life of the document or the lifespan of the document. So we talk about incorporating a living document into the daily work day. I think it's important to talk about how this differs, and I think it depends on a person's position within a museum. We all come from places where there's 2 staff, all volunteers, 120 staff, etc. But I think the first thing to do is to have everybody understand what their role is in terms of this document. I say general versus detailed, but you could break that down further. You could have subcategories between general and detailed. But those are sort of the 2 categories that we have. The people who need to know the plan generally, which in our case is maybe 30 out of 41 staff, and the people who need to know it in a detailed fashion, which of course is approximately the other 10 or so people. In our case, those detailed people, the people that need to really going to be living this day in and day out, are mostly operations, collection staff, upper management, people like that, people who are going to be considered essential staff. So they should indeed, not only should they be exposed to this more often, they should be more familiar with the document as a whole. I think it's also helpful in a daily sense to schedule overviews and trainings of this plan as part of other activities. You don't have to. You could do it individually, but let's face it, if I say we're going to have an 8-hour day training on the emergency plan, that might not be as palatable as pairing it with perhaps someone's new orientation process or CPR training that you're going to have, or an annual review, or a strategic planning session, or things like that. It's not so much that we're cloaking it, or hiding it, if you will, but parts of the plan will inevitably tie back to these other activities. Certainly with CPR and things, that's true. But it's going to tie back to them, and it's going to be relevant at the same time. And I just think it's helpful to reiterate to everybody how this plan ties back into everything that you do. And as we talked about at lunchtime, the physical placement sounds silly, but the physical placement of the plan does have an effect. In our case, we have 4 copies of the plan for the property, because we have essentially four buildings, and one of them is 62 miles from the other 3 buildings. So we have 4 copies that are just at the kind of general administrative desk, if you will, of each of those buildings. Then all of our essential staff, and this is something I always have to test people on, are to have their own copy. And it's not to be kept on site. I personally keep mine in the trunk of my car, because not in my house, because the house could get burned down, not at the museum, because that's where the emergency just happened, and I can't find the manual if the museum just blew down. So the essential staff are supposed to have a copy. They're supposed to have it off-site, and easily accessible, and safe and secure, and those types of things. But that does matter, almost in a visual sense to some degree. So even if your general staff don't know much about it, they probably are walking past a copy when they walk past the administrative assistant every day or something. Excuse me, and Elise, you're going to help me on time, so let me know. The other thing we want to talk about is, this is maybe not a daily thing, but of course we all tackle these things at least annually, and that's budget and strategic planning and how the plan ties into that. I am a firm believer that certain parts of your museum, and these would all have different titles, of course, but in our case, operations and collections specifically, when they annually go to talk about strategic planning or annual work plans and things of that sort, they should have this plan, less than 4 feet away from them or something. It should be in the back of their head, and it should act as a guide for them to think about things that they might do in the future, 1, 2, 3 years out, however far you're planning. So I give this example. And let me reiterate that not all planning things that we come up with have direct dollars, so don't always think about, you know, things that cost money, because a lot of what we have to do doesn't cost staff time, but it doesn't cost money in that sense. But I give this example. If the plan were to state, and this is just all made up, but if the plan were to state everybody in collection must know basic paper salvage techniques, and you had that in there and everybody agreed with it and it was great, and then you might look at that one time and think, gee, does anybody know how to do paper salvage techniques? Do we have the supplies to do this sort of work? Do we know where we're going to store the stuff if it gets wet, etc.? That might cause you to say, you know, we don't. Maybe we should hire a trainer to teach us. Maybe we should put something in our budget and our plan to buy the basic supplies to perform this salvage work. And it seems funny because you would think, well, why would you put that in there if you hadn't thought about it? But that happens all the time in plans. People list things that we must do this, we shall do this, we will do this, but oftentimes the back end of that has not been thought of in terms of time, people, or money. So I do think that these areas specifically, and if you have a smaller institution, it might be everybody, look at this plan and use it as a guide in budgeting, and especially in budgeting and in strategic planning, so that you can tie in. We were talking at lunchtime about various projects that are coming up as people are going through these plans. They're realizing about updating records, perhaps getting fireproof cabinet to put records in and things so that they, you know, wouldn't burn or get damaged by water. So again, your plan might have said, we will protect all our records. Well, that's great, but you know, how are you going to do that? And had you considered all of those things? And so this is another case where you're going to look at it, a chance for you to look at it annually and figure out how it ties back into what you do on a daily basis. And I mean, the biggest part, and I feel like at my institution we might be jumping the shark, so to speak, at this point sometimes, and that is to avoid complacency. And I think the only way to do that, outside of, God forbid, having repeated emergencies happen to you, which nobody wants to happen, is training, training, and training. There are a lot of types of training. I mean, what we've all been doing for 6 months is obviously a wonderful form of training. There's tabletop trainings, which I won't go into detail on all of these things, but you know, various exercises. Online tools you can use, individual assignments, group edits and reviews, having outside people review. I do think it's important, though, and I say individual assignments, and I think that does come up, but I do think it's important that a lot of as much as possible, that your training take place, you know, with as much interactive activities as you can manage. You know, even if it's just 2 people, I think it's important that people bounce ideas off of each other and you know, get a feel for what it is they're doing. We do, you know, random fire drills and things like that. You know, most of our tabletops and training are focused around hurricanes and forest fires, because those are kind of our 2 major things. And my point about complacency with us is that I worry that sometimes we focus too much on those 2 areas, and we should consider some other parts of it. And I would also suggest that you document your training very literally, who attended the training and when did you have it and what types of things did you do, and to assess your training. Survey your efforts. I mean, whether it's 2 people or 40 staff that you trained in it, you do a survey monkey, or you could do it on paper or whatever. But ask the staff, you know, did you get something out of it? Did you enjoy this? Was this helpful? Etc. And I do think there aren't too many opportunities where you should really do massive training. I think, you know, when you get 30, 40, 50 people in a room, everybody's going to feel like they're at here I am sitting at a college campus. Sorry, I was going to say a boring college lecture, but you know what I mean. They might feel as if it's a little more not as personal that way. So sometimes the training is best in smaller groups. And let me do this. And I do think it's also important to periodically test the staff. I know I get groans from people when they hear this, like, oh my God, I got to take a test. I don't mean it literally like that. I basically mean that even as simple as weekly staff meeting in some smaller groups, and just asking everybody, now, does everybody remember where the plan is, or are you an essential personnel, or are you a non-essential personnel? Just maybe quick questions like that. We recently, when was passing through recently, I had a bunch of staff that were emailing me and asking, am I an essential personnel? And I'm thinking, you know, okay, we really got to address some of these things because, you know, maybe they don't know, maybe they haven't been properly told. So little tests like that. I don't mean written, you know, structured tests where you get a grade or something like that. Because if you did ask somebody that and repeatedly they kept saying, I don't know where the plan is, or I don't have anything to do with that, then you could really figure out that you probably need some different training. The other way I think to avoid complacency, whether you need it or not, or whatever the process is, I think, and that's why I put air quotes around it, I think you should obtain approval from your governing authority on a semi-regular basis. We talked about this at lunch as well. A lot of times a board would just be like that. Look, you could have 60 pages of blank paper in between the binder, and they'd probably approve it. And we hope that's not the case. But if they did do that, that's fine. The point of this isn't for your board or your governing authority to be that better versed on the plan. It's for you and your staff to go through the process of understanding that you need approval for it. It's an important document. You should be familiar with it. You've told your governing authority about it, let's say every 12 months, and you've told them you're well versed on it, and you've told them you know everything about it. So, boy, I better go back and really make sure I do know everything about this, because when they come and ask me about it, since I've asked for their approval 65 times, I better know what's in it. And I think it's a very good process. In my case, it's a resolution. It takes like a month, and it's kind of got a lot of pomp and circumstance that goes with it. But we don't do it every year, but we try to do it every couple of years, and I do think it's very beneficial. And then, of course, we should review and update the plan. And I say choose a date, and please don't get hung up on the actual date. We have lengthy discussions sometimes where people are, we had something going on one time, it was like, oh, that's too close to President's Day, or I think that's my son's birthday, or whatever. Those things are, no offense to anybody, they're just not relevant. And it's not so much a matter of scheduling a year out when, let's say, the 6 of us can all get together. It might not be us. We don't know who will be around the table. Just pick a date, pick something that's reasonable. Don't pick things years and years out. And pick dates for different things. I mean, you could have a date at 6 months to have a couple people look at it. You could have a date in a year to get it reapproved by a board. You could have a date in every 3 months to have, collection staff look at it. But for whatever reason, I think that's a stumbling block for a lot of people, is that they neglect to want to, or they avoid, choosing that physical date. And I do think it should occasionally, very occasionally probably, be literally edited for typos, readability, process, ownership, functionality, and etc. I know that sounds kind of boring, but you do know that other people will be reading this plan, and you want to make sure it makes sense to them. And I also think you should decide who will preview it. I think you should have some people who know the document and some who don't. And as I say, literally read through it. I don't mean read through it in a room, because as my previous slide I said, edit it. I think you should edit it in a linear fashion. So you should sort of get a chain of comments about it, and then sit together for group talk and group discussions and things like that. But I'm not a big believer in group edit. That's a very hard thing to do. But I do think you should read through it and really kind of be literal about it every once in a while. And I think it's helpful to publish it in some formal manner to the staff, whether it's at an all-staff meeting. And I don't mean publish as in 47 people get a copy, but maybe you point out they're in new binders and they're in new locations, and you sort of unveil it, if you will. Part of that is also to point out the effort that has gone into it, to let the other staff who maybe aren't essential understand that the essential staff has spent 10, 15, 20 hours, whatever it is, working on it, so they get the sense of the importance of the document. So I don't know if I stuck to my 20 minutes. At least my timekeeper just says I'm dead on, so I'm going to turn off my microphone, and I guess we'll take typed questions and or questions via the microphone here.
And the question that was asked here is, where is your facility? So I'm going to let you answer that question.
Sorry, I could have done a little introduction. We are located smack dab in the middle of the Everglades, between Naples and Fort Lauderdale off of Alligator Alley. And so we are about 65 miles from either one of those large urban areas, and about 45 miles from any kind of urban area. So we do not have, we're very self-sufficient or else in terms of resources. And we are on the Native American Indian Reservation. So that is our governing authority. We're in a county, and there's some overlap with emergency response, but not really. The tribe is actually sovereign and has all of its own EOC and things like that.
And Anne, this is Miriam. I'm going to jump in and say, because I suspect some people don't know, the Atatiki Museum is part of the Seminole tribe. And while you are 65 miles from any civilization, this is an extraordinarily beautiful museum, and it is one that is absolutely worth going to see, both inside and on the boardwalks outside the museum. So for those who don't know the Atatiki, because Anne isn't going to do it, I'm going to jump in and highly encourage. And I see actually people in my room who've been to visit who are shaking their heads and saying, yes, this is really a pretty amazing facility. So other questions? I am not going to take the lack of questions here as, I'm going to take that as the fact that you were wonderfully clear, Anne, with suggestions and recommendations of how to make this a living document. And to use it, this is Miriam's voice, to use it as an opportunity to reinforce the point that we're really trying to make today, which is that you, in the process of creating this emergency plan, early on you created a table of contents. And from the conversations that I've been listening to over lunch today, some of you are really ready to fill in and are almost finished with having completed every item on that table of contents, and others are really feeling like they are behind, or they haven't done as much work as they would like to have done. And so I really want to reinforce one of the messages that Anne gave us, which is that go ahead and start sharing this document. You're going to be updating it. You're going to be revising it as time goes by. And better to start with something than to say, I'm waiting for a perfect document, because there is no such thing as a perfect document.